Frederick, Colorado. A peaceful suburban town, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked at night, where neighbors smiled and waved at each other while walking their dogs, where families gathered for weekend barbecues. It was the kind of town where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. At the center of this quiet community was the Wilson family. To those who knew them, or at least thought they did, Mark and Emily Wilson were the picture-perfect couple. Mark, a 33-year-old oil field worker, was known as a hard-working and responsible man, someone who took pride in providing for his family. He had been working at one of the biggest oil companies in the region, a stable job that paid well and ensured a comfortable life for his wife and children. Emily, just a year older than Mark, was the heart of the household. She was vibrant, full of energy, and always seemed to be smiling. She had turned her passion for wellness into a thriving online business, working from home while raising their daughters, Anna and Sophia. Her social media was filled with happy moments, pictures of family trips, videos of the girls playing in the backyard, heartfelt posts about how much she loved being a mom. From the outside, their life looked perfect. A spacious two-story home in a quiet neighborhood, two beautiful daughters who adored their parents, and an exciting new chapter on the horizon. Emily was pregnant again, this time with a baby boy they planned to name Nathan. But behind the perfectly curated social media posts, behind the carefully crafted image of happiness, things were not as they seemed. Beneath the surface, cracks had started to form. Tensions were brewing, small arguments turning into long silences. Emily had started noticing things: Mark coming home later than usual, his phone always face down on the counter, text messages he would quickly dismiss if she glanced at his screen. At first, she tried to ignore it. Maybe he was just stressed from work. Maybe she was overthinking things. But deep down, something didn't feel right. There was a shift in the air, an uneasiness that settled into their home, creeping into every conversation, every interaction. Emily had always believed in love, in commitment, in family. But for the first time, she found herself questioning whether the man she had married was still the same person she had fallen in love with. By the summer of 2018, the once perfect Wilson household was no longer the warm, loving place it had been. The tension between Mark and Emily was palpable. Friends had started to notice that Emily wasn't as bubbly as she used to be. She would smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She spoke less about Mark, and when she did, there was a hesitation in her voice. Lisa Thompson, Emily's best friend, had been one of the few people she confided in. Late-night phone calls, whispered concerns. Emily had started to suspect that Mark was seeing someone else. She hadn't confronted him yet, but she was sure of it. The way he acted around her had changed. He was distant, detached, like he was already somewhere else, with someone else. She wanted to believe it wasn't true. She wanted to believe that the man who had once held her hand through difficult times, who had kissed her forehead after long days, who had cried with joy when they found out they were having their first child, she wanted to believe that man was still in there somewhere. But by August 2018, she wasn't so sure anymore. And on the night of August 12th, just hours before everything would come crashing down, Emily sat alone in her hotel room in Arizona, where she had been for a business trip. She stared at her phone, scrolling through old photos of her family, trying to find reassurance in the memories. She wanted to believe that whatever was happening, it could still be fixed. She typed out a message to Mark. "We need to talk when I get home." She hit send. Mark read the message but didn't reply. The next morning, she would return to Frederick, to the house they had built together, to the man she had once trusted more than anyone in the world. She didn't know it at the time, but she was walking straight into a nightmare. The quiet suburban neighborhood of Frederick, Colorado, was used to slow mornings. The sun rose lazily, casting soft golden light over rows of nearly identical houses. Sprinklers clicked on, dogs barked at passing joggers, and children's bicycles lay abandoned in front yards, waiting for the afternoon rush of laughter and games. But on August 13, 2018, something was different. By 9 a.m., while the town followed its usual rhythm, Lisa Thompson sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Her mind was racing. Emily was supposed to be at her prenatal appointment by now, but she hadn't answered any texts or calls. That wasn't like her. Emily was meticulous about her schedule, especially when it came to her pregnancy. Lisa tried calling again. Straight to voicemail. The uneasy feeling that had been creeping up since morning turned into full-blown panic by 1:40 p.m. Lisa couldn't sit still anymore. She drove straight to the Wilsons' house, her fingers drumming against the steering wheel as she replayed their last conversation. Emily had sounded off the night before, not quite herself. Was she just tired from traveling, or was something more going on? When Lisa pulled into the driveway, she felt her stomach tighten. Emily's car was still parked inside the garage. That didn't make sense. If she had gone out, she would have taken her car. Lisa stepped out of her own vehicle, walked up to the front door, and knocked. Silence. She knocked again, harder this time. Emily. It's me, Lisa. Nothing. She glanced around, hoping to spot a neighbor outside. No one. Everything was eerily still. She peered through the front window. The house looked undisturbed, no signs of a struggle, no furniture overturned, no broken glass. But something was definitely wrong. Lisa's heart pounded. She reached for her phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. 911, what's your emergency? Lisa took a deep breath. My friend is missing. She was supposed to have a doctor's appointment this morning, and she's not answering her phone. Her car is still here, and she swallowed hard. I don't know. Something feels wrong. The dispatcher asked a few more questions: Emily's name, her last known whereabouts, any recent problems she might have mentioned. Lisa answered as best as she could, her voice shaking slightly. We're sending an officer to check it out, the dispatcher assured her. Stay at the scene if you can. Lisa nodded even though the dispatcher couldn't see her. Okay. She hung up, her fingers trembling. Minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up to the house. A uniformed officer stepped out, adjusting his belt as he approached Lisa. He introduced himself as Officer Bradley. You're the one who called? Lisa nodded quickly. Yes. I'm really worried about my friend. She's pregnant, and she would never just leave without telling someone. Officer Bradley studied the house before walking up to the front door. He knocked firmly. Police department. If anyone's inside, please make yourselves known. Nothing. He tried the doorknob. Locked. Lisa shifted anxiously. I know she wouldn't leave without her purse or phone. If I could just She stopped mid-sentence when she noticed something in the window. Wait, her purse is on the kitchen counter. Officer Bradley frowned. Are you sure? Yes. Look. Lisa pointed. Right there. That's her bag. The officer nodded. That's strange. If she left willingly, she would have taken it with her. Lisa felt her breath catch in her throat. Exactly. Officer Bradley stepped back and radioed for additional units. Within the hour, detectives arrived. They walked around the property, checking for any signs of forced entry. There were none. Everything appeared normal. Too normal. As officers made their way inside after obtaining a key from a concerned neighbor, they conducted a preliminary search. The house was neat and orderly, no signs of struggle, no indications that anything violent had happened. But there was something off. Emily's cell phone was found on the couch, screen dark, as if it had been placed there intentionally. Her keys were sitting on the entryway table. Her wedding ring, something she rarely removed, was left on the bedside table. Detectives exchanged looks. This wasn't just a simple case of a woman leaving on her own. Something was definitely wrong. By the time 5:30 p.m. rolled around, Mark Wilson finally arrived home. He pulled up to the house, his expression shifting into one of surprise as he saw the police vehicles lining the street. He stepped out of his truck, walking up to the officers with a confused look. What's going on?" Detective Rogers, the lead investigator, turned to him. "Are you Mark Wilson?" Mark nodded. "Yeah, what's happening?" Lisa stepped forward before the detective could answer. "Where's Emily?" Her voice was sharp, demanding. "Where are the kids?" Mark blinked. They're not here." Lisa's stomach dropped. "No, Mark. They're not here. Their stuff is inside. Their car is still in the garage. And Emily missed her doctor's appointment." "What's going on?" Mark rubbed the back of his neck, looking around as if searching for an answer. "I don't know. She was upset this morning. We argued, and she said she needed some space. I assumed she took the kids somewhere." Detective Rogers watched him carefully. "Mark, when was the last time you spoke to your wife?" Mark hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering. "This morning, before I left for work." "What time was that?" "Around 5. Detective Rogers exchanged a glance with his partner. "And you didn't hear from her after that?" "No." Lisa folded her arms. "Then why is her phone still here?" Mark's face paled slightly. I don't know. Maybe she left in a hurry." Detective Rogers wasn't convinced. "Mark, can you come with us to answer a few more questions at the station?" Mark's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Yeah. Of course." As the officers led him to the squad car, Lisa felt a cold dread settle into her bones. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. Something terrible had happened to Emily and the kids. And Mark was hiding something. The morning of August 14, 2018, began with a sense of unease that stretched across the small town of Frederick. The news of Emily Wilson and her 2 daughters disappearing overnight had already begun spreading beyond the neighborhood. Friends, neighbors, and local volunteers started forming small search groups, checking parks, gas stations, and highways. Missing persons posters were quickly printed, and social media exploded with posts urging anyone with information to come forward. Lisa Thompson hadn't slept. She had spent the night pacing around her house, replaying every conversation she had ever had with Emily over the past few weeks, looking for anything that could explain this. She knew Emily had been worried about Mark, that she had suspected something was going on. But Lisa never imagined it would lead to this. By mid-morning, reporters had begun arriving outside the Wilson house, cameras flashing, microphones poised, ready to capture whatever happened next. It wasn't long before Mark Wilson stepped out onto his front lawn, a carefully painted expression on his face. He stood stiffly in front of the cameras, rubbing his hands together as though trying to appear anxious, but something about his demeanor felt wrong. "I just want my wife and kids to come home," he said, his voice strained but oddly robotic. "Emily, if you're watching this, please, just bring the girls back. We can figure this out." For anyone watching, his plea should have felt heartbreaking. A husband, a father, desperate for his family to return. But something was missing. His tone lacked real urgency. His body was rigid, too controlled. He blinked more than necessary, swallowed too often, and shifted his weight from foot to foot as though standing there was unbearable. And then there was the strangest part: he barely mentioned his unborn son. Mark spoke about Emily. He spoke about the girls. But he never once pleaded for Nathan, the child Emily was carrying. It was a detail that seemed small, almost insignificant. But to those watching closely, it was telling. Inside the police station, investigators watched the broadcast in silence. Detective Rogers leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he observed Mark's performance. "He's lying," he muttered. His partner, Detective Hughes, nodded in agreement. "It doesn't feel real. It's like he's playing a role, but he doesn't know his lines." The police had already begun digging into Mark's background. Phone records, financial transactions, work schedules, anything that might shed light on his recent behavior. What they found raised even more red flags. His calls to Emily had dwindled in recent weeks. Instead, there was a pattern of repeated calls and messages to an unknown number. When investigators traced it, they discovered it belonged to Rebecca Monroe, a 30-year-old woman who worked at the same oil company as Mark. Further digging revealed that Rebecca and Mark had been spending an unusual amount of time together: lunch breaks, late-night calls, hotel bookings. Mark had been having an affair. The revelation was like gasoline thrown onto an already burning fire. A missing pregnant wife, 2 missing daughters, and now a confirmed affair? The police didn't say it aloud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. They needed Mark to talk. On August 15, 2018, the detectives called Mark back to the station. This time, they had a plan. Mark arrived looking slightly more disheveled than the day before, but he was still composed. Too composed. Detective Rogers wasted no time getting to the point. "Mark, we need you to take a polygraph test," he said, setting a folder down on the table between them. Mark blinked. "A what?" "A polygraph," Rogers repeated. "A lie detector test. You said you wanted to help, right?" For the first time, Mark hesitated. He rubbed his hands together, glancing toward the mirrored wall. "I mean, sure, yeah. Of course." The test was set up within the hour. Mark sat stiffly in the chair, wires attached to his fingers, his breathing shallow. The examiner's voice was calm and methodical as they asked the control questions: his name, his age, his address. His responses were steady, controlled. But when they started asking about Emily, the girls, and the morning of August 13th, things changed. The machine picked up the spikes immediately. His heart rate increased. His breathing became erratic. He swallowed hard, his fingers twitching slightly against the armrest. "Do you know where your wife and daughters are?" "No." "Spike. Did you have anything to do with their disappearance?" "No." "A bigger spike." The session lasted about an hour. When it ended, Mark exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "So? How'd I do?" The examiner barely looked at him. "You failed." The silence that followed was suffocating. Detective Rogers, who had been waiting just outside, stepped back into the room. "Mark," he said, sitting down across from him. "This is the time to come clean." Mark's jaw tightened. He exhaled, shaking his head. "I didn't do anything." Detective Rogers leaned forward. "Mark, listen to me. You failed the polygraph. We know about Rebecca. We know about the affair. We know you had motive. If there's something you want to tell us, now is the time." Mark's fingers tapped against the table, his knee bouncing slightly. He looked down at his hands, then back up at the detective. And then, for the first time, his expression changed. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he mumbled. Detective Rogers didn't flinch. He let the silence stretch, giving Mark room to keep talking. Mark swallowed. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke again. "Emily, she found out about Rebecca. She was furious. She told me she was leaving, that she was taking the girls." Rogers nodded slightly, encouraging him to continue. "She lost it? She just snapped." His breathing hitched. She hurt them. The girls. I tried to stop her, but he shook his head, his face crumpling. I had no choice. I did what I had to do. Silence. Detective Rogers took a slow breath before speaking. His voice was calm, measured. Mark, no one is going to believe that. Mark's face went pale. His fingers twitched. He had expected the detectives to react differently, to be shocked, horrified. Instead, they were looking at him like they had been expecting this all along. Because they had. They knew from the moment he opened his mouth that he was still lying. His story didn't add up. It didn't match the evidence. There was no struggle in the house, no blood, no sign of any kind of violent altercation. If Emily had hurt the children, there would have been chaos. But there wasn't. Emily hadn't done this. Mark had. And now, the clock was ticking. They had his confession, just not the truth. Not yet. The air inside the interrogation room was thick, heavy with the weight of what was unfolding. The dull hum of the overhead fluorescent lights cast an eerie glow on Mark Wilson's face. He sat slumped in his chair, hands clasped together, fingers twitching slightly. His eyes darted between the detectives in front of him. His breathing was uneven, shallow. Detective Rogers leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. Mark, we already know what happened. You might as well tell us the truth. Mark swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. His fingers tapped an erratic rhythm on the table. Detective Hughes slid a stack of papers toward him: phone records, security footage stills, time-stamped text messages. Pieces of a puzzle that Mark had tried to keep hidden. Look at this, Rogers said, tapping on one of the images. It was a grainy shot from the Wilsons' neighbor's security camera, time-stamped 5 a.m., August 13, 2018. It showed Mark's truck, backed into the garage, its bed open. A shadowy figure moved near the rear of the vehicle. Mark stared at the photo, his jaw tightening. Emily found out, didn't she? Rogers continued, his tone softer now, almost coaxing. She confronted you about Rebecca. Mark blinked rapidly. His face twitched. She told you she was leaving. Taking the girls with her. A muscle in Mark's jaw flexed. His breathing became more erratic. And that was it, wasn't it? Silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Mark spoke. I didn't want to lose them. Rogers and Hughes exchanged a glance. This was it. He was cracking. Mark exhaled sharply and wiped his palms against his jeans. Emily came home late that night, he started, voice shaking. She was tired. We barely spoke at first, but then she started asking questions. She had seen something on my phone messages from Rebecca. His hands clenched into fists. She lost it? Started yelling, asking me how long it had been going on. I tried to deny it at first, but she already knew. He swallowed hard. She said she was leaving me. That she was taking the girls and that I'd never see them again. His voice cracked. I couldn't let that happen. For a moment, the room was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Mark's breathing was heavy, ragged. Then he continued, his voice hollow. I told her to calm down. That we could talk about it. But she didn't want to hear it. He exhaled a shaky breath. I don't even remember making the decision. It just happened. Detective Rogers didn't move. What happened next, Mark? Mark's eyes were distant, as if he was watching it all unfold again in his mind. The girls were asleep, he murmured. I didn't want them to wake up. The room felt colder. Afterward, I panicked, Mark said, voice hoarse. I needed to get them out of the house before anyone noticed. I backed my truck into the garage, loaded them in. His voice was so quiet now that the detectives had to lean in to hear him. I drove. To where? Rogers asked. Mark licked his lips. His fingers gripped the edges of the table as he whispered, the oil field. Detective Hughes took a slow breath. And when you got there? Mark clenched his jaw. His shoulders trembled slightly. I knew I had to get rid of Dash. He stopped abruptly, shaking his head. I couldn't leave them like that. Someone would find them. What did you do? His hands trembled as he covered his face. His next words were barely audible. I put them in the tanks. A heavy silence hung in the room. On August 16, 2018, investigators, now armed with a confession, made their way to the isolated oil field where Mark had worked. The site stretched out for miles, flat, barren, with nothing but dry grass and metal pipelines cutting through the land. The morning air was crisp, but the weight of what they were about to find made it hard to breathe. The first thing they discovered was the shallow grave. The dirt had been disturbed, hastily packed down. As forensic teams worked, it didn't take long before they uncovered what they feared. Emily's body, wrapped in a thin sheet, lay beneath the surface. Not far from the grave, investigators turned their attention to the massive cylindrical oil tanks standing side by side. They were tall, rusted structures, towering over the field like silent sentinels. Detective Rogers stood at the base of one of the tanks, staring up at it, his stomach twisting. Check inside, he instructed the forensic team. Using specialized equipment, they carefully opened the access hatches at the top. What they found was worse than anyone could have imagined. Floating in the thick, black sludge were Anna and Sophia. The recovery process was excruciatingly slow. The oil, dense and suffocating, had made preservation nearly impossible. The realization of what Mark had done choosing this place, this method, left even the most seasoned investigators sick to their stomachs. Back at the station, when Mark was informed that they had found everything, he simply nodded. No tears. No remorse. Just a man who had finally run out of lies. The horrifying truth had come to light. And now, there was nowhere left for Mark Wilson to hide. The courtroom was silent. The air inside was thick with an unspoken tension, the kind that clings to the walls and settles into the bones of everyone present. The date was August 21, 2018, and Mark Wilson sat motionless in his orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed together in his lap. His expression was unreadable, no anger, no sadness, just a blank, distant stare. Across the room, Emily Wilson's family sat in the front row. Her parents, once full of life, now looked hollow, their eyes dark and sunken from days without sleep. Lisa Thompson was there too, gripping the armrest of her chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She refused to look at Mark. She couldn't. The judge entered, and everyone rose. The proceedings began. The prosecution laid out their case in painful detail. They described how Mark had betrayed his wife, how he had planned his actions meticulously, how he had driven his own daughters to their final moments with the cold calculation of a man who had already decided his family was disposable. The defendant, the prosecutor said, his voice steady but firm, did not act in a moment of passion. He did not act in self-defense. He had choices. And every choice he made was deliberate. Calculated. He turned slightly, gesturing toward Emily's grieving parents. And now, an entire family is destroyed because of him. Mark sat still. He never raised his head. When it was his defense attorney's turn, the approach was different. They painted Mark as a man who had snapped, a man under extreme emotional distress, a father who had made a terrible mistake. They pleaded for leniency, arguing that he should be given the possibility of parole. The courtroom was tense. Then came the moment that would solidify Mark's fate. Emily's father, Richard Carter, stood to give his victim impact statement. His voice was hoarse, as if speaking at all required a physical effort that drained him. "My daughter loved that man," Richard said, pointing at Mark. "She loved him with everything she had. And this is what he did to her." His voice wavered, but he didn't stop. "She was carrying their son. Their son. And he took that life away before it even had a chance to begin." Richard took a shaking breath. "I will never forgive you, Mark." He swallowed hard. "And I hope that for the rest of your miserable life, you see their faces every time you close your eyes." The room was so silent that even the ticking of the courtroom clock felt deafening. Mark didn't react. By November 6, 2018, Mark Wilson sat before the judge once more. The trial had been avoided altogether. Rather than face the overwhelming evidence against him, he had chosen to plead guilty to all charges, sparing himself the death penalty. The decision was met with mixed emotions. Emily's family had chosen not to seek capital punishment. "It won't bring them back," her mother had said in an interview. "We don't believe in vengeance. But we do believe in justice." And justice, in this case, meant life without the possibility of parole. Mark's sentence was handed down in a single breath. He would spend the remainder of his days in a maximum security prison, never again to walk free. Never again to see the outside world. For the first time during the entire hearing, Mark showed emotion. Not regret. Not sorrow. But something closer to acceptance. He exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging slightly, as if he had finally realized the full weight of what he had done. And just like that, the gavel came down. The case was closed. Life in prison was not kind to Mark Wilson. The moment he entered the Colorado State Penitentiary, he became a target. Inmates had their own code, and harming one's own family, especially children, was the kind of crime that even the most hardened criminals found unforgivable. For the first few months, Mark was placed in protective custody, isolated from the general population. But isolation brought its own torment. 23 hours a day in a concrete cell, a narrow cot, a steel toilet, the sound of distant voices echoing through the hall. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a lead blanket. Guards reported that Mark rarely spoke. He ate mechanically, barely acknowledging anyone around him. If he dreamed at night, no one knew. He never talked about it. He had once been a man with a house, a wife, and 3 children. Now, he was a number. A forgotten name in a system built to keep people like him away from the world. The only letters he ever received were from journalists asking for interviews. He never responded. Outside of those prison walls, the world moved on. The Wilson home was sold within months, the once cheerful house now a grim reminder of what had happened there. No one wanted to live in it. It remained on the market for over a year, sitting empty, its windows dark. Lisa Thompson, still struggling to process the loss of her best friend, became an advocate for domestic violence awareness. "If someone you love starts acting differently, don't ignore it," she said in an interview. "Don't wait for something bad to happen. Speak up." Emily's family set up a foundation in her name, supporting pregnant women in crisis and helping them find resources to escape toxic relationships. Time didn't heal everything, but it moved forward, pulling everyone along with it. Everyone except Mark. Because for him, time had stopped on August 13, 2018. And it would never start again. The town of Frederick, Colorado, had changed. It was no longer just a quiet suburban community where families thrived and neighbors greeted each other warmly. It was now known for something much darker, something that would never be forgotten. The Wilson case had left an unshakable scar, not only on those who had known Emily and her daughters but on the entire nation. As days turned to weeks, the media frenzy surrounding the case began to slow. The court proceedings had ended, Mark Wilson had been sentenced, and the details of his horrifying actions had been fully revealed. But for those who had been closest to Emily, Time did not erase the pain. Lisa Thompson, the best friend who had first raised the alarm, struggled with guilt. She replayed every conversation she had ever had with Emily in the months leading up to that fateful August morning. She thought about the little things: how Emily's smile had seemed forced lately, how she had hesitated before answering questions about Mark, how her texts had gone from long, excited messages to short, vague responses. Had the signs been there all along? Could she have done something, said something that might have changed the outcome? Lisa wasn't alone in these thoughts. Emily's parents, Richard and Diane Carter, carried an unbearable weight of grief. They had adored their daughter. They had loved their granddaughters. And now, they were left with nothing but memories and the suffocating pain of knowing that they had never even suspected the monster that lurked beneath Mark's charming facade. They weren't the only ones who felt betrayed. Neighbors who had once admired Mark as a hard-working family man now avoided even speaking his name. Some removed old family photos that had included the Wilsons, unable to look at them without feeling a deep sadness. The once bustling home at the end of the street stood empty, its windows dark, its walls holding echoes of a life that had been violently taken away. But beyond the local community, the story of the Wilson family resonated across the country. People everywhere asked the same haunting question: how could this have happened? The truth is, these tragedies rarely happen overnight. They build slowly, like cracks forming in the foundation of a house. At first, they are nearly invisible: small arguments, unexplained distances, subtle changes in behavior. But over time, those cracks grow deeper, wider, until one day, the entire structure collapses. Mark Wilson had not become a monster in a single moment. He had been living a double life long before Emily ever found out. The affair with Rebecca Monroe wasn't just an impulsive mistake, it was part of a deeper deception, a selfish escape from a life he no longer wanted. And when Emily confronted him, when she threatened to take away what little control he had left, he made a decision that shattered everything. Emily had trusted Mark. She had loved him. She had built a family with him. And yet, in the end, it was him she should have feared the most. That is the most terrifying lesson of all. But could this tragedy have been prevented? Hindsight is always clear, but even before the events of August 13th, there were signs. Friends noticed Emily withdrawing. She stopped talking about her marriage. She avoided answering direct questions about Mark's behavior. She smiled less. Even Mark had exhibited warning signs: he became more distant, more secretive. His work schedule became erratic. He spent more time on his phone, guarding it closely. He showed less patience with his daughters, often brushing them off when they wanted attention. Individually, these things may have seemed insignificant. But together, they painted a picture of a man who was slowly unraveling. The lesson here is clear: always trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't ignore the little things. Don't brush off uneasy feelings. Speak up, ask questions, and, most importantly, don't wait until it's too late to take action. This case isn't just about one family, it's about recognizing the darkness that sometimes hides behind the most ordinary faces. If you or someone you know is experiencing warning signs in a relationship, don't stay silent. There is always help available. There are always people who care. And sometimes, one conversation, one decision, can be the difference between life and death. What do you think about this case? Were there moments when this tragedy could have been prevented? Could Emily have escaped before it was too late? Could anyone have stopped Mark before he made that irreversible decision? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life crime stories. Until next time, stay safe and stay aware.